welcome all of you to this evening's webinar, the Gaza and Ukraine wars, recent developments, geopolitical implications, and paths to greater peace and justice. I'm Joseph Gerson with the Campaign for Peace, Disarmament, and Common Security. I don't think I need to say very much about the urgency of the moment. Israel has been traumatized by the October 7th mass murders and hostage-taking. An estimated 6,000 Palestinian civilians have been killed and at least 15,000 wounded, while the entire population of Gaza is suffering from devastating bombings, the siege which denies them water, electricity, fuel, and medicines that are essential for life. And we face the probability of a deadly Israeli ground invasion of Gaza with massive casualties on each side, and the dangers that the war could escalate into a full-scale regional war. Meanwhile, and now getting less attention, in Ukraine, we are approaching the end of the second year of a devastating war with what seems to be a stalemate and murderous trench warfare that is reminiscent of the futility of World War I. Each side is pursuing maximalist goals and appears determined to avoid serious negotiations until the 2024 U.S. presidential elections have been held. Winter is coming, and we face the continuing danger of both horizontal and vertical escalation. And amidst the tectonic post-Cold War geopolitical changes, the outcomes of these two catastrophic wars are deeply integrated and may impact the rest of the world. In fact, they already are. The great powers, the global South, and the contest for Asia-Pacific hegemony. We're privileged this evening to have two uniquely experienced and committed experts to help us understand the backgrounds, recent disastrous developments, and suggested actions that we should be taking for peace and justice.
It's a little strange to think that we're doing a presentation tonight on Palestine, Gaza, and Ukraine, the two crisis zones. It took the massacre of October 7th and the ongoing massacre in Gaza to push Ukraine off the front pages for a while, but that crisis remains crucial. I've been thinking a lot about how we come to understand these crises, and I always come back to the notion that our understanding of history, our understanding of reality, often starts with when we start the clock. And it's particularly dangerous, I think, when we start the clock today, whenever today is, and particularly when there's a particular crisis that happens on a single day. So the crisis in Israel on October 7th was a horrific, very serious human crisis. And not surprisingly, it was shocking. It took us all by surprise, and it was a horrible thing to see. It, for a while, I think, pushed aside the ongoing horror of what existed in Gaza and had been going on, the 16 years of siege, the 5 separate bombing raids that had ranged from 1 week to 3.5 weeks and had led to the deaths of thousands, the attacks on nonviolent protests over the years, all of that. And so the other day when I was watching Biden's speech, luckily with a group of people at Busboys and Poets, where we had just finished a discussion with the UN Special Rapporteur on Human Rights in the occupied Palestinian territory, and then moved to Biden's speech, it was rather astonishing to hear the plan for an additional $105 billion worth of military and militarized purchases around this country. And I started thinking about what Dr. King had taught us so long ago, that budgets are moral documents. In this case, we might say immoral documents. But in many ways, I think the hypocrisy and double standards that have been so central to US foreign policy for so long were so visible in that announcement. Dr. King's statement that the bombs in Vietnam explode at home, they destroy the dream and the possibility for a decent America, kept coming back to my mind. And I started thinking again about what this is going to mean in terms of what the US looks like to the rest of the world, the impact on the global South, the countries whose governments, as responsive or not responsive as they may be to public opinion, virtually all condemned Russia's invasion of Ukraine. Certainly over the years, they have all condemned Israel's occupation and apartheid policies, but they wouldn't support, for example, the US sanctions against Russia because they don't see it in isolation from ongoing struggles. So the issues of US sanctions and US sanctimony at the same time was very, very visible in that context. The things that Joseph mentioned earlier, the impact of 16 years of a siege and now an absolute tightened siege where no water and no electricity, no medicines can get in, where doctors are treating the thousands of wounded without anesthesia, doing surgery on children without anesthetics, holding them down on the steps of a lower level, perhaps, of what remains of the hospitals. The virtual destruction of Gaza, over 5,000 dead, half of them children. This is one of the astonishing things that we just don't think enough about until suddenly it gets even worse and we hear about it. And then suddenly we remember, I thought that I knew pretty much almost everything. I had read everything I could find from the UN agencies, from everybody else about the humanitarian crisis in Gaza over these last years, these last decades. But I read something the other day that just stunned me, that I had no idea, that under the 16 years of siege, before this siege, it was bad enough that 20% of Gazan children are stunted by the age of 2 because there's simply not enough quality food with protein, fresh vegetables, fruit. None of that is available. None of that is available. And the children are now showing it in their bodies. That's a whole generation where 25% of the children are stunted. And that's never going to be reversed. That's something we all are going to have to live with, and that the people of Gaza live with on a daily basis. So why would we be talking jointly about the crisis in Gaza and the crisis in Ukraine? We heard from President Biden that both Hamas and Russia are both trying to destroy democracies on their border. It's like, really? That's what's going on here? You know, if we want to look at David and Goliath, we're kind of on different sides in these different wars. Massive support historically since 1967, especially even before that, of course, but with the so-called special relationship that started in 1967, despite the existence of Israel as a Goliath carrying out occupation and apartheid for so many decades against the Palestinian people. That didn't stop US support. The US support for Ukraine, which was not, you can't really say Ukraine was a David in this context, but was certainly not Goliath. It was Russia that occupied Ukraine, not the other way around. So it's kind of a reversal there, but President Biden was trying to persuade us that it was all just the same thing. So of that $106 billion that he announced, $61.5 billion is going to go to Ukraine. 2/3 of it, almost, is going right to the military of Ukraine. Add to that the $67 billion that the US has already sent to Ukraine just for the military side. There's been about another $40 million for economic and humanitarian support, but $67 billion so far for military aid. That means a total of $123 billion of our tax money that's been given directly to the Ukrainian military in a year and a half. It's an extraordinary amount. The military budget of Ukraine is $30 billion. So we've already given, well, let's see, 30 is what, about a quarter of all that we've given this year. So you can do the math. Look at the math on the Israeli side. The amount of money that Biden announced the other night out of this $106 billion is $14 billion, is going to go directly to the Israeli military. $14 billion. Add to that the almost $4 billion that the US has already given to the Israeli military, as it does every year, based on an MOU signed by President Obama. And you get $18 billion of our tax money just this year. Israel's total military budget this year is just under $24 billion. And we're now giving them $18 billion. That's 3/4 of their budget on top of their budget. It's an astonishing thing. And their budget is more than the total military budgets of Egypt, Iran, Lebanon, and Jordan combined. So there's something, as Martin Luther King would say, there's something way off on the morality side here when we look at how this is working. And then at the UN, we see the United States once again, this is not an old story, once again rejecting ceasefires. You know, we saw this in 2006 when Israel was at war in Lebanon, and then Secretary of State Condoleezza Rice went to the UN and said, we don't need a ceasefire yet. There's not enough dead people yet. We have to wait a while. We saw it again in 2008 and 9 in what Israel called Operation Cast Lead against Gaza, and again in 2012, and again in 2018, and again in 2021. And each time, with these days and nights of bombing in Gaza, the world was calling for a ceasefire. Just a ceasefire, just stop the killing. And each time the US said, no, not yet. We're not ready for a ceasefire yet. Not enough children have died yet. That's the reality of what this policy looks like. And in that context, you know, we see these continuing wars that the US has carried out, the wars that together made up what's called the global war on terror after 9/11, which we were told was all about preventing weapons of mass destruction, which, hello, never existed. We were told it was about human rights. Really? Whose exactly? We were told it was about diplomatic solutions, which were never allowed to be even considered. The tiny territory of Gaza, one of the most densely populated, tiny little strips of land in the world, has just been bombed in 1 week with more bombs than attacked Afghanistan in any year of that 20-year-long war. That's what the current Israeli policy, with our support, our money, our bombs, is doing to the population of Gaza. This isn't a war against Hamas. This is a war against the entire population of Gaza, and it's designed to make them leave. It's, of course, exacerbated when US provided warplanes with Israeli pilots fly over and drop leaflets that say, if you don't leave, you will be treated as partners in a terrorist organization, meaning we can kill you with impunity and no one will hold us responsible. The Israelis are safe saying that because so far nobody has held them accountable. And that's on us. That part is on us. So all of the reliance that the US likes to talk about the rules-based order, which has somehow, somewhere along the line, replaced actual international law, which exists like in a book, you can look it up. Rules-based order, that's somebody making it up. That doesn't exist anywhere, except as a rhetorical way of not talking about international law. But when you look up international law, you find a number of things that are illegal. One of them is that you can't punish people collectively. You can't punish a population for the actions of some group of people within that. So, for example,
Phyllis, this is just your 3-minute warning.
Okay. For example, what that means is that the actions of Hamas based in Gaza, who carried out a horrific illegal attack on October 7th, is an illegal attack. People should be held accountable. They should be condemned. And you cannot punish the entire population in response to that. That's what international law says. It also says that you can't carry out attacks on civilians, that you can't carry out attacks that don't distinguish between civilian and combatant areas, all of that. What we are seeing right now, and I will end with this part, is that there has been, over the last 25 years, a movement in this country and around the world designed to change the discourse, the narrative about what Israel represents, what Palestinian rights are all about. And we now have made incredible gains in that. Some of you may have seen the other day, the Wall Street Journal, of all places, an extraordinary article about the Nakba, what Palestinians, the word means catastrophe in Arabic, and it refers to the massive dispossession and expulsion of Palestinians from their land, from their homes. 750 Palestinians became refugees overnight in 1947 and 48. And the population of Gaza, 70% of it are those refugees and their descendants. So these are the people who are saying, we're not going to leave. We are not going to leave. And the movement that has been built in this country and around the world, we were seeing it this week with protests all around the country, around the world. On Wednesday, the protest that brought together hundreds and hundreds of Jewish activists from around the country, 300 of them arrested in the Cannon House office building. 25 of those arrested were rabbis. This is an amazing moment. This is a moment when 25% of American Jews and 38% of young Jews have told pollsters that they believe Israel is an apartheid state. The question is that going to change with the current crisis and the current escalation of rhetoric around that crisis? And one thing that we're seeing is that people are not buying the claims of the Biden administration. People are saying, and again, the polls are showing 78% of people in this country want a ceasefire. That has been the demand of every protest this past week and ongoing. The crisis now is for a ceasefire. That's the demand.
I shall echo a great deal of what Phyllis said, which I entirely agree with. I would also link what is happening and the US response or non-response to certain aspects of US diplomacy, of the stated policies or previously stated policies of the Biden administration, which have been wrecked or put into abeyance by what is now happening. The first is climate change, declared by the Biden administration when it came in to be an existential threat to the United States. And of course, responding to it, to be fair, very much at the heart of the so-called Inflation Reduction Act. But the whole issue of climate change has simply disappeared from the headlines, and with rare exceptions from administration language since these wars began. Jake Sullivan, in his piece just published for Foreign Affairs, mentioned it, but very, very far down. Unless I missed something, President Biden did not mention it in his address at all. One of the reasons, of course, why one does have to try to preserve cooperation with other great powers around the world, even ones that one doesn't like, is for the sake of action against climate change. And yet, in the run-up to the Russian invasion of Ukraine, it was miserably clear that nobody, and by the way, I include, well, Russia, it goes without saying, but European governments as well, on this, nobody was factoring the effects on action against climate change into any of their calculations about what was likely to happen in Ukraine. So there, once again, there is a radical misallocation of American attention and American resources. The second thing, which is, Phyllis mentioned aid, something that has astonished me ever since I first came to Washington is the United States' extraordinary neglect of its immediate neighbors to the south. Neighbors whose problems are vastly exacerbated both by the US appetite for drugs and the US war on drugs. The neglect has been astonishing. And if you look at the aid figures, in 2 years, well, this aid package alone, Ukraine has received more than 12 times as much as Mexico and the whole of Central America over the past 20 years. Despite the fact that, of course, American politicians, at least some of them, complain bitterly all the time about the problems for American society being caused by drugs and illegal migration. The only solution that some American politicians have now managed to come up with is the idea of deploying the US military to Mexico as part of the war on drugs, not something that will ever be accepted by the Mexicans. But if there were ever an indication of the moral and political bankruptcy of US primacy, even in its own hemisphere, you could hardly ask for a clearer example than that, while at the same time, enormous sums of money are poured into countries far from America's shores for ostensibly geopolitical reasons, though one might well question the rationale for this. A third point is very much responding to President Biden's address, in which he yet again used this phrase, or dug it up from the dead, the indispensable nation, that American leadership is essential for the world, that the world would go to hell if America did not dominate the whole of the world. Well, I don't have time to go into what's happening in the Far East. I've mentioned Central America. But if you look at the Middle East, I think one can say that while a different hegemon, Russia or China, might have made an even bigger mess than the United States has made of that region over the past 25 years, they would have had to work pretty hard at it. It would be hard indeed to find a bigger record of not just failure, but in many cases willful failure than US policy in this region. So on what basis, on what moral basis or evidential basis America is claiming primacy here, for me is very difficult to say. And that brings me to my last point, which is that the Biden administration has emphasized in its rhetoric the need to reach out to what we used to call the third world or the developing world. We are now learning to call it the global south, which is something of a misnomer, but never mind. In any case, the non-aligned or the well, not quite the non-white world, because there are also, of course, Japanese and South Koreans in it. And very much the need to reach out to this, but basically as part of the competition with China, that America needs to win over sympathy and support for these countries against China, and also to some degree against Russia. Now, everything that America has been doing and saying about Gaza has, in fact, worked to confirm absolutely in the eyes of people around the world, and not just in China and Russia, and in Latin America, but in countries that in principle wish to be US partners like India. But they have been confirmed in their view that the West really only takes notice of atrocities, or certainly only attempts to take action against atrocities, if they are A, committed by our geopolitical enemies or rivals, and B, that they are directed against white people. And this really does not go down well in the vast majority of humanity, who the United States administration says it wishes to appeal to, but in fact is showing enormous disrespect for, and a disrespect that is seen by a great part of the world as frankly racist. And one figure that I have seen, but which I have not seen noticed anywhere in the American mainstream media, is that of course people are and should be deeply concerned for the US Israeli citizens who were killed in the Hamas terrorist attacks, which were indeed unconscionable. And of course, deeply worried, more worried it seems than the Israeli government, for the safety of the American citizens. But we should be worried about all the hostages taken to Gaza. But of course, the American government does have a particular responsibility, a legal, a moral responsibility to American citizens. But there are about 30 American citizen hostages of Hamas in Gaza, from what is believed to be the case. I have read that there are around 600 Palestinian American citizens in Gaza today under Israeli bombardment, and yet that is mentioned nowhere. Now, if that isn't an indication that in the American establishment there are American citizens first class and American citizens second class, it would be hard to see a clearer example of that. And once again, that is noticed elsewhere in the world, and it does the most terrible reputational damage to America.